Mr. President, there's publications given to us on the floor of the Senate. One of them is the executive calendar. This executive calendar and parts of it may be characterized as a political obituary column, because you see, these are the nominees of the Obama administration for important posts across America. And the names on here, many of them have been sitting for months, some for over a year, waiting for Senate action. So far this year, we've approved 17 federal judges, 2 circuit court judges and 15 district court judges. There are 20 judicial nominees still sitting on this calendar. You think to yourself, well, they must be pretty controversial if they're still sitting on the calendar. Every single one of them was reported unanimously from the Senate Judiciary Committee. There were no dissenting votes, no objections. And still, they just sit and sit and sit on the calendar. Why? Well, we know we have a serious problem. Not just these 20, but the fact that we have 87 vacancies in the federal judiciary, many of them in an emergency situation. Why? Why in the world would some of these nominees, some of whom have been supported by Republican senators, why aren't they being called for a vote, a routine vote, on the floor of the United States Senate? It is part of the obstruction that the Republican Party has decided to make part of their leadership in the Senate. And of course, Exhibit A in that obstruction is the vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court occasioned by the untimely death of Justice Antonin Scalia. It's been nearly 2 months since President Obama nominated Chief Judge Merrick Garland to fill the Scalia vacancy on the Supreme Court. It's been 3 months since Justice Scalia passed away. 3 months. 3 months, and still, the Republican-led Senate has refused to consider President Obama's nominee to fill this Supreme Court vacancy. We ought to be doing that right now. Today, we received all of the investigative materials and binders and answers to questionnaires from Judge Garland, boxes after boxes, thousands of pages, available to be reviewed by the Senate Judiciary Committee and every member of the Senate. It's the Senate's constitutional obligation under Article 2, Section 2, to provide advice and consent when the President submits such a nomination. Mr. President, it's rare for a political figure, a public elected official to stand up and use the word never, but I'm about to use it. We have never in the history of the United States Senate denied a Supreme Court nominee from the President a hearing and a vote. Never. In 100 years that these nominees have been sent through the Senate Judiciary Committee. We had a press conference today, and we talked about the precedent. Senator Franken of Minnesota noted the time when John Adams had lost the presidential election, but filled a vacancy on the Supreme Court by nominating John Marshall to be a member of that court. So here was John Adams, a defeated president, making a nomination to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court. In the Senate on those days, there were still founding fathers, men who had actually written the Constitution. 5 of them were members of the Senate when John Marshall's nomination came before them. If there was ever a lame duck, it was John Adams, who had been defeated for re-election and had a few months more to serve, made a nomination for the Supreme Court, and by voice vote, the United States Senate approved him, including the 5 founding fathers who joined in that effort. The argument being made on the Republican side is, well, we can't fill this vacancy until after the election. We've got to wait and see if President Trump will be chosen by the American people, and he'll get to fill this vacancy on the Supreme Court. Interesting. I missed it. I read that Constitution and thought for sure that President Obama was elected for 4 years in 2012. By the Republicans' math, it was 3 years and 2 months. He's a lame duck and has no power left. Well, they're wrong. By a margin of 5 million votes, Barack Obama was reelected president over Mitt Romney. And now this decision by the Republicans to stop this president from exercising his constitutional authority is just wrong. What about Judge Garland? Judge Garland is one of the most extraordinary nominees ever presented to this Senate. He is now the Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit. That's the second highest court in the land. Well respected. He's received the endorsements of so many different groups. People that are conservative and liberal alike respect his judgment, as they should. He's done his job and done it well, but the Republicans in the Senate refuse to do their job. They say it's because they want the next president to fill that seat. I cannot even imagine the nominee that a President Donald Trump would send to the Senate. Last week, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, a man named Reince Priebus, announced that Mr. Trump was the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party. It's astonishing to me that Senate Republicans would seriously want to put Donald Trump in charge of filling Supreme Court vacancies. How would they explain that to their constituents? Most of them are saying they're not even going to attend the Republican convention for fear of what it will do to their political reputations. And yet they're trusting the judgment of Donald Trump to shape the highest court of the United States of America? Make no mistake, by failing to move on Merrick Garland's nomination now in a timely and fair way, Republicans have cast their lot with Mr. Trump. That's a risky bet for the American people. The American people also understand Merrick Garland is well qualified, rock solid. Every week we see more praise for him. Last week, 9 former solicitors general, Republicans and Democrats alike, sent a letter, public letter, praising Judge Garland. The list of people who signed this letter includes prominent Republicans and Democrats: Ken Starr, Drew Days, Walter Dellinger, Ted Olson, and Paul Clement. We know the Solicitor General serves as the federal government's chief advocate before the U.S. Supreme Court. These men know the Supreme Court as well as anyone, and they know a good judge when they see one. Here's what they said about Judge Garland. As a group, we have argued hundreds of cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal courts of appeal. Each of us has served as the U.S. government's top representative before the Supreme Court. And while we've served in different administrations, we are unified in our belief that Judge Garland is superbly qualified to serve on the Supreme Court if he were confirmed. We are confident that Judge Garland would bring his brilliance, work ethic, and broad experience to the cases that come before him. Very high praise, isn't it? Clearly, President Obama selected a nominee highly regarded by advocates who know the Supreme Court better than most. Yet my Republican colleagues will not even give this superbly qualified nominee the dignity of a public hearing. They would rather keep a Supreme Court seat vacant for more than a year and allow the court to deadlock for a year with 4-4 votes on key cases and wait in the hopes that they can roll the dice with President Donald Trump and his Supreme Court nominee. It's hard to fathom how this strategy is either constitutional or in the best interests of our nation. Not only are Senate Republicans failing to do their job and consider Judge Garland's nomination, they're obstructing 20 other well-qualified judicial nominees who are currently pending on the Senate floor. The Senate Republicans, as I've said, have held votes on only 17 judicial nominees. That is the lowest total in decades, far fewer than the 68 judges the Democratic-controlled Senate confirmed in the last 2 years of George Bush's administration. Republicans are apparently content to leave vacancies on courts across the United States and even on the Supreme Court of the United States. Is that why they were elected? To leave vacancies on these courts? They cannot hide from the fact that there is a need in this country for competent jurists to guide us in these federal courts. I hope that a few more of my Republican colleagues will come to their senses. Rather than save judicial seats for Donald Trump to fill, they should do their job and give President Obama's well-qualified nominees a hearing and a vote, and they should start with Merrick Garland.